Hi, and welcome to another edition of Dr. Bickmore's Why Wednesday interviews. And my guest this week is Brendan Kiely. And we have been friends for quite a while now. We ran into each other at NCTE, and I think I'm one of the few people that acknowledged I knew him before All American Boys came out, right? So, it's been a while that I've known him. And a couple of years ago, I believe, Brendan, we began to talk that you were writing this nonfiction piece, right? And you said you had it in the works, and you kind of even suggested that maybe I would get to see it early. I didn't get to see it early, but I did get to see an arc. And the book we're talking about today, as well as other books by Brandon, is The Other Talk. And do you want to frame it a little bit for us, Brendan, and what this book is for you and how it fits in with the rest of your work?
Thanks. Yeah, first of all, it's really fantastic to see you, Steve, and it's great to be here. So thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it. And our friendship does go back, and believe me, I'm grateful. I'm really grateful. So it's sad to not be crossing paths in person at every possible conference we could be, but this is better than nothing. So thank you very much. But The Other Talk, I'm gonna just I'll hold it up as well. The Other Talk. Yes, I have been working on it for a little while, but I want to contextualize it like this. The talk. Many people are familiar with the talk, and often, actually, I was just listening to Anatomy of a Scene. The New York Times has those Anatomy of a Scene, short docs, and the director of The Hate You Give was talking about a scene in the movie in which Starr's family has the talk. Often it's a talk that is in Black households that's about protection and safety and navigating racism in America, and also about pride and about cultural pride. When Jason Reynolds and I were traveling around the country and talking about All American Boys, and even before he and I wrote that book, when he and I were first getting to know each other, we had many conversations about how he grew up with the talk, the talk, and how I grew up without a talk. There was plenty of discussion in my household, within my white family, about racism, but none of it was a request or an investigation or a kind of analysis of my own racial identity. And so the Other Talk really is, I think, an attempt to get white families to have a conversation about what it means to have racial identity, our racial identity as white folks, as a piece of the larger conversation about how to combat and dismantle racism in our communities. Because I don't think we can really do justice to trying to dismantle it if we can't even talk about our own racial identity. And for me, I think if we're going to talk about what it means to be a white person, then we have to talk about what it means to have white privilege. So for me, that's what The Other Talk really is about. It's about us beginning to accept that as the cornerstone of our racial identity, really. And what do we do to acknowledge that, to help us be better allies and co-conspirators to dismantle the racism in our communities?
Yeah, I think that's so interesting, because you and I, we're both white males. I am of a different generation than you are, probably much closer to your parents than I would like to acknowledge. But, when you're talking about the talk, there was no such thing when I was a kid. The talk with your parents would mean, oh, they're going to talk about sex. We're going to have a talk about sex. If somebody would have said, oh, have you had the talk, I would have thought about that. And then with my father, it was even different than that, because for him, the talk was pay your way. He came from parents who lived through the Depression, but it was never about, it was about making your way in the world and being responsible, but it wasn't about the privilege that I had of being white. Mm-hmm. That was just something that radically was in my face when I moved as a kid from Tucson, Arizona to Las Vegas, Nevada. And all of a sudden I was going to schools that were 25 to 30% Black. right? Overnight. So I come from seventh grade with virtually no diversity in the schools I was in Tucson. So a few Mexican Americans, but even then the schools, the neighborhoods I lived in were fairly white. But all of a sudden, when I moved into Las Vegas, that was a different experience. Then I was fortunately a student body president, and the vice president the year I was student body president was a Black kid from a different part of town than me. And Alvin and I ended up having a really unique relationship because we were the only two males in student government at the senior level. Right? So we had this unique alliance, because we could be outvoted at any moment by, four or five females on the group. But my experience in knowing how we were radically different was Alvin telling his story of what it meant to be a sophomore and junior in this high school, and my experience of what it was to be a sophomore and junior in a high school. In both years, we were closed because of race fighting, race riots. And then for us to both find ourselves in student government our senior year, we experienced those high schools differently, right? Yeah. And there was nobody except for Alvin helping me navigate that, right? So I have it wasn't my parents, it wasn't other adults in the wider community. It was just a city in the 70s, Las Vegas, that was kind of in turmoil because of some of the conflict that was taking place in schools. Yeah. And we probably could have used some knowing conversations about that.
Yeah.
But I don't know that they were happening at very many levels in the 70s.
Well, and it's interesting because I think about how I've seen on social media, for example, people talking about how for many of us, we're just learning about the Tulsa race riots and Black Wall Street and what had happened. Race riots is not even the right way of describing that. The horrific massacre, massacre, destruction, and yet I was watching people respond to that and saying, but this is a story that my family, meaning more often than not, when I saw that it was a Black family, saying this is a story that my family has discussed quite a bit. And I think about that with regards to the talk, because I think about how I might be ignorant to how many people of color from a variety of cultural backgrounds have probably had versions of a talk in one way or another for generations. That may have morphed and changed a bit due to circumstances and shifting pieces of our culture. But for white folks, it's interesting to hear you sort of walk back through the generations, because there's such a powerful narrative for so and so's family arrived here at X year, and they were coming from Ireland, Germany, France, Sweden, whatever country in Europe, let's say, and we pulled ourselves up from our bootstraps. And I think what's kind of missing in that story is a historical understanding of what it meant to become white. And so for me, I guess one of the things that I find interesting about what you're talking about is, what would it have meant for the possibility for more racial justice if people for generations if white folks for generations had been talking about, yes, we worked hard, yes, we tried to make our own way, and we've had advantages because we live in a country in which laws, social customs, and a variety of institutions create access for us in a way they don't create for other people. It was designed that way. And it doesn't take...
And I think you get some of that in your book. That's some of the arguments you take up is how do we look at this trajectory in different ways? I mean, even if we were to study the history of Harlem, for example, well, in the 1860s, maybe it was the Irish immigrants who were, as soon as they landed, conscripted into the Union Army, right? Because they were Irish. They weren't really seen as somebody who we want to automatically embrace, but we can put them to war, right? And then what happens after that when the Italians move in? Or if we can cycle through generations of who has lived in Harlem and for what periods of time,
Yeah.
and what has happened to those people as they attempt to assimilate into our society, and
Yeah.
who have we helped and who haven't we helped, who is
Right.
allowed to, the phrase bootstrapping is just so terrifying to me, because like it's first assuming that we even gave the people bootstraps to reach down and grab, right?
Right.
Well,
Exactly.
grab the boots. Well, you haven't given me any boots yet. Well, oh well, grab the bootstraps anyway.
Right.
So I think that there's some real damaging irony when I look at how people want to say that, and I for one am grateful for the things I have, but I don't understand how people can't acknowledge the ways in which, Spike Lee's company is, 40 acres and a mule, right? Well, we know that was an unfulfilled promise, right? But we talk about it, and I think most people want to believe that it was a fulfilled promise, but it wasn't, right?
Exactly. So that's part of why I think that I think I've been speaking already. I've run a couple of book clubs for the Other Talk. So as of this recording, the Other Talk comes out next week, and I've already done a couple of preliminary book clubs with teens, excuse me, and they've around the country. So some teens in New York, but some teens in northern Michigan, teens in Atlanta, and it's been interesting hearing them talk about some of the same stuff that we're talking about right now, about how they run up against that kind of narrative in their schools today. I don't want, so they're white. This is sort of what some of their peers say. Like, I don't want to, as a white person, they don't use that phrase usually, but white kids say, I don't want to talk about white privilege, essentially because it makes me either A, feel bad, or B, it runs counter to the narrative that is so strong in our family that it feels like it's an attack. And what I'm trying to do with the Other Talk is to get away from that. I don't want to, I think that's a distraction. I honestly feel like it's a political distraction, and it has been. I mean, look at some of the examples that were used in Stamped, from the beginning, but then also the Stamped remix that
right.
Jason wrote. That historically, this has often been the case. And so for me to try to write the Other Talk, the idea was, how can I do this in a way where we can grapple with reality, but we can also use it as a way to be empowered? Because I think there's an opportunity for people to know themselves and their history better, so that they can engage in the present more meaningfully and more productively and more honestly. And I think there's a way to do that if we can, as I do in the book, try to lay out some examples from I do it from my own life, but in families in general, you could simply talk about some of your own family stories in a way that doesn't vilify you and your family, or I try not to vilify myself too much in the book. I'll certainly make fun of myself, but show where my life is an example of this kind of white privilege, how it fits into the history, but how I'm still, I'm not a bad person. I can still work and operate in the world, but maybe with a bit more knowledge and self-knowledge and self-awareness.
Well, I think that's one of the great things about this book. If I were teaching this book or leading a book discussion for, anybody, I would like to pre-catalog as a pre-reading activity 5 to 10 of the things you point out. Like the way the GI Bill was constructed would be one that I would do, right? The way that redlining works. And I would ask people to read this book. I said, before we open the book, why don't we look at the history of some of these policies and how they were enacted and how they were carried out, regardless of what the intention was. Right. Some people put forth these bills with good intentions, and then others say, well, in order for you to pass that, we've got to exclude this, right? And often who was excluded. So I think there's a lot of pre-reading that could be done with this book, and that's one of the things I admire about this book, which is really, I think, a pretty frank but easy to read conversation for people who need to figure out how to talk to their kids. right? And you're doing that now. And I think, how did I talk to my own kids who grew up in Salt Lake City? And then the youngest two, we moved to Athens, Georgia while we were doing a PhD. And all of a sudden, here's Abby as a sophomore, you know, who's in a school that's 50% African American and 50% white, right? And the classes are structured, right? You know, so that they're, in some ways, they can easily be classified by race, right? Rather than by ability, right? And that's for them to navigate that, and to their credit, both my son and my daughter did a very nice job of not hating us, at least in person, for making them leave where they were, but also navigating friendships that we thought might have been more difficult for them.
Yeah.
They didn't find overly difficult. And so I think, well, I looked at my wife a couple of times and said, well, maybe we did a few messages right. You know, maybe they're making friendships with people that are different than them in much easier ways than we anticipated. Right? Yeah.
I think that's great. I mean, it's important to foster the right kind of desire to connect with other human beings, so that your children are seeking authentic relationships with whomever they are, whoever their peers might be. And I'm hoping to try to do that with our son as well. We'll see how it goes. We'll report back in 20 years and see what happens. But I think part of that search for authenticity, at least in my opinion, I think about some of the instances in my own life where I was making assumptions in conversations with people of color that really came out of my own ignorance. And no matter how well-intentioned I was, and no matter how well-intentioned I wanted to be, not thinking carefully about how my racial identity preceded me into the conversation in many ways meant that no matter how much I wanted to be authentic, sometimes I could not be as authentic as I wanted to be with somebody who I really cared about. And so having more context, and I share some of those examples in the book, right? I mortify myself with some of my stupid mistakes, but I do it, you know, not just because I like making fun of myself, but because I think it's really important for us to see, like, what a missed opportunity, and what a better way to begin to enter into more authentic relationships by having a better understanding about how my racial identity affects my life, but also the lives of people around me.
Yeah, you do some very nice examples of that when you're teaching, you know, and you're aware of something, you say, oh, let's do this. And then you realize, oh, maybe you have to walk that back. And right. I find myself, I think, doing that all the time, because as much as I might feel like I have good intentions, I have, you know, as a university professor and somebody, you know, teaching pre-service teachers, I'm doing it without some lived experiences that I probably should have had, and assumptions that I make, right? And so I'm constantly trying to step back, and when I'm teaching a class, say less and listen more about what their concerns are. And it's been difficult often, right? And I have to say, okay, thanks for helping me understand that better, right? And what should I do next, right?
That I really appreciate what you're saying, because I think that's essential, right? To be able to listen without being defensive, to be able to really listen, and to not just pay lip service to listening, where you allow people to say something to you, but you're really dismissing it. That's not really listening, right? And I think people in general, some do that maybe more often than we could, but I think in particular, to be quite honest, I think white folks do that all the time. And we do it in ways where if you know, a colleague is talking about the effects of yet another incident of police brutality, and how it resonates in their family, and we might say something like, yeah, but that was just a one case scenario, or yeah, but there was, you know, there are these look at all the progress that's been made, or, you know, phrases that they show that we haven't listened to what has just been said, but instead of dismissing it, so that I still feel more comfortable and that my world isn't shaken too much. And I guess, so I really appreciate what you're saying, because like in teaching, students can shake up our worlds all the time. and that's a good thing, right? And it only helps us become better teachers. And likewise, I think as white people, if we do a better job listening to folks of color, as you know, something that is more ingrained in us from a young age, then I think maybe we can be better friends. We can be better colleagues. We can be better people. And it's a weird way to put it that way, but I think it can be true.
I think it's, you know, I was fortunate to be on the ELATE Commission as part of NCTE, which is the commission on, used to be called the Commission on English Education. And I was on the board for a while, and David Kirkland was on the board. And I admired David's career. You know, he's done really good. And as a Black scholar, I learned a lot. And I realized being on that as a really pretty new assistant professor, David had more to offer my students in one visit than I maybe did in a semester, right? And I remember asking him once, I said, what is somebody like me with a lot of classroom experience, white, what do I have to offer the conversation? What do I do next? And the most honest thing he ever said is, he said, Steve, I don't know. I don't know what to tell you to do next, right? I said, maybe this conversation is what we do next. But he was in some ways saying, I can't anymore tell you how to be a white professor who's aware of this problem. Right. And you can tell me, say, hey, get over it, right? You know, neither one of those things can happen. So like I run into you, I try to run into David, right? And say, how are we doing? You know, what's happening? What can we do better? What can we do differently, right? And I think it's an ongoing quest. To figure that out.
I think so too, and that's something I really appreciate as well, because I think that's, you know, it's called, you know, the other talk, or we're talking about this, right? But it isn't supposed to be a finite thing. It isn't supposed to be a one-time thing. It's supposed to be part of the process of how we live moving forward, right? I mean, it's that. So I appreciate that, because I think that's part of the search for authenticity in some regards. I don't know, I'm making this phrase up, I'm probably going to regret it later, but for it to be a perpetual process, for it not to be an end, for
a constant conversation, I would say. It's like, you know, I have students, and here in Las Vegas, many of the schools are as much as 80% Latinx, right? And they were telling me that they'd chosen a diverse book for their school, and they were going to teach The Hate U Give. And I said, okay, great book. Yeah. You said you were going to pick a book for your students, 80% of which are Latinx. So how is that book really speaking to their existence? Maybe in some regard with how, you know, Black and brown populations are marginalized by police brutality or racial conflict in a city. But aren't there other books you might have chosen that would represent a larger Latinx experience, right? So sometimes we even look at this problem when we think about race in America as it's, okay, if I'm not going to have a white book, I better have a Black book. Yeah. Well, maybe that's not your student population at all, right? Your student population might be Latinx, or here we have a large number of refugees in some of the schools from Liberia and the Congo who are true African refugees, you know, first generation. Right. So maybe The Hate U Give isn't the book they need either, right?
Well, right. And it seems it would be sad on some level if we're relying on one book to speak to everybody's experience in a pluralistic society. And it just isn't therein lies part of the problem as well, I think. Like we should be delivering a multiplicity of texts to a diverse community, a diverse country. I mean, it only seems it seems like a no-brainer, right? Like shouldn't we be reading a whole lot about a whole lot of different experiences, but to make sure that for folks who are in our communities who are there, their experiences are not excluded, right? Yes. So that we find you know, texts that represent our community, and that should be a multiplicity, I hope.
Well, it should be more and more, and a lot of self-selection. We could talk about what to do in the classroom for forever and a day, right? Because it can be a tough deal. But again, I'm so glad you got this book out in the world. And like I say, we could talk about, and I just want people, this is not a book to be afraid of. It's not a book. I think you've achieved, if people read this openly, it's not a book designed to make you feel guilty. It's a book designed to say, well, what can I do? How can I help? What conversation should I have, right? And I think even though maybe it's framed as the other talk that white fathers and mothers need to be having with their children, it's also a conversation. It made me feel more comfortable with the conversations I'm having and attempting to have with my colleagues of color. Because I'm coming at it from a way and saying, oh, this gives me more knowledge about where the conversation needs to be. Because now maybe we have some shared information about looking at different points in our history.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I as you're saying that, I'm thinking about how part of the inspiration, but as part of the impetus to write this, as I mentioned before, with some of the conversations that Jason and I had. But somebody was asking me about this recently, and I said, at the end of All American Boys, Quinn's had this realization that, there's more that I need to be aware of. There's more that I want to do. There's more that I want to participate in. But where does he go? Who does he talk to? And the idea was this, well, it's like this, like the other talk. He could dive in and have this talk with somebody, and maybe there's some folks there. And maybe, I appreciate the way that you sort of provided that context. If it's not meant to make people feel guilty, it is, again, I hope it's a source of empowerment so that we can all of us participate in these conversations about racism more meaningfully, because we want to. I mean, there's a poll that I read and included in the book that says, 71% of white Americans say that racism is a problem in America. But if 71% of white Americans think racism is a problem in America, then 71% of white Americans also need to talk a whole lot more about what white privilege is, because that's our lives. As Claudia says, right? It's not privilege, really. Privilege gets everybody feeling all funny because they think of economics, but it's really just white living.
Yeah,
it's the experience of living as a white person in our country.
Yeah, no, my parents, for example, never once said, oh, you might just be mistreated by the police. I might have been, but it wasn't high on their list of possibilities. It was, and it's not that I was, you talk about driving. My dad had a couple of Porsches, and once I was in Logan, Utah, we were up for a family vacation, and I took that Porsche too fast down a hill past the college, and got pulled over. But it didn't matter. It didn't matter at all, because my middle name was shared by the coach at the high school. Yeah. And all of a sudden, he said, aren't you driving a little fast? I said, yeah. And but nothing happened. It was just a conversation, and I was sent on my way. But it could have been much different. And I think about the stories that are told and how it plays out differently for people, in which I just naively assumed I was having a run-of-the-mill experience. Well,
and so that example is a great one, right? Because that's a similar story that I share in the book about speed and the police officer, as I say, and people have probably heard me share the story in some presentations too, but the police officer looked at me with compassion, with pity, was like, this is a kid who deserves a second chance. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. I'm saying that that's something that I took for granted, but I also wish was more often the case for more folks in general, right? Not only folks like me, but more to the point, having the other talk, I think, helps me understand how I was taking that for granted, or rather, as a young person today, I shouldn't take this moment for granted, because my white racial identity is actually playing a role in this moment. And that's why I think talking about this is meaningful, because there are going to be moments where people speed. There are going to be moments where, like I'm not trying to like fix reality in a way,
Yeah.
but I think it is then also true that we should be accountable to what we take for granted.
Yeah.
Then begin to ask ourselves, is there something I can do so that what I'm taking for granted can be more often the case for more folks? And it's not only interactions with the police. This is also the segregation that happens in our educational system. This is also about how the inequity of our healthcare system. This is also about, food justice. So
banking, real estate transactions, all those kinds of things. And we could talk about this forever. I think you and I are both committed, and we hope others are too, of having this conversation, not only with white friends, family, and colleagues, but that we're more courageous in listening with our colleagues and friends of color that we have. And I, reading your book again, I found myself, I'm sometimes a late night reader, and I'm sitting there alone, with one lamp on, reading the book, shaking my head at myself, going, oh yeah, because if we read this openly, as teacher, I resonated with those, I really like the Kyle Korver story, is really interesting, because yes, you can do so much, and then you have to step aside because somebody else has to do something. And if it's just acknowledging, no, you don't need to listen to me, you need to listen to these people, right? Now I know you have your attention on me, but now what can we do? And it's like last year, after all the stuff that happened in the spring, I just, so last fall, I didn't teach, the only books I taught by white cis authors was you, because we were doing All American Boys and Jason was on it, and Jo Knowles, because she was a keynote at our summit. But out of the 25 books, I chose all the diversities that I could think of, because I thought they'll get the other books, or they might know the outsiders. And today we don't need to teach the outsiders, we don't need to teach The Giver one more time. I have nothing against those books.
They're great.
They're going to be around, and they're going to be there, and they're easy to talk about. But I can take other examples, and talk about, Meg's book, Mercy Suarez, and talk about, look, here's a kid growing up, with problems that sound like yours, but she also has this marker that makes her different, right?
Yeah, and I mean, that's one of the reasons why I loved E.B. Du Bois' American Street. There's something, I love that American was in the title, because that's common sense for a lot of folks, that yes, this is part of the American experience too. But for many people, and certainly for people, educators in my own growing up experience, or educators even when I was an educator, would have considered that so outsider, that it wasn't to be brought into the classroom in the same way. And that's part of the racism. That's part of the problem. Whereas bringing that in and incorporating that in, and I think pairing that with All American Boys is an interesting discussion about America in so many ways. Pairing that with a whole number of other texts from around the country.
Well, I love another book that I love to hear Matt De La Pena talk about is Inside Out and Back Again.
Yeah.
And I think, some people think maybe that book's old now, and I think not that old. And given what we've just done in the world, with Afghanistan and others, thinking a simple book written in verse about a Vietnamese immigrant might be a reminder that, that's not an easy move, right? Being an immigrant is not an easy move. And we want to invite them in, sort of, right? And what does that mean? What is the experience of those people? But, well, this has been a wonderful conversation. And I hope, we could go through a lot of your books, and I hope people know the other books that one of my favorite books in the last 10 years is The Last True Love Story. I don't know if it's because, what was going on with my own parents and other things when I was reading that book, but it's a beautiful book. So but I think it's time for people, and like I say, it comes out next Tuesday. We'll be posting this on Friday, and I hope people share it. Feel free to link to it in your shameless self-promotion, which you should be doing, right? On there. But it's been great to talk to you again. But as you say, we've had a conversation for 40 minutes where we haven't had any downtime, right? And the irony is you and I can have this conversation, but if it doesn't go past us, it doesn't go to our children or other generations or classrooms, and if it doesn't have cross-racial conversations, then we probably haven't achieved your goal. And we haven't achieved my goal as an educator, as a pre-service teacher. So
yeah, no, I appreciate it, but it's fantastic to be here, and I'm really grateful, and I hope whoever's listening will reach out and ask how we can have the conversation too.
And take us to task if we've said something wrong, right? You know,
yeah.
If we've been on the margin of something, say, well, wait a minute, when you said this,
yeah,
what do you really mean? And I sometimes really frankly don't know what I mean. I do know that my intention is to help now, but I don't know if all my actions are helpful.
Well, yeah, I feel very similarly. I feel like my ignorance will always be greater than my wisdom, and that's why I want my door to be open. So you know, I would prefer to work more towards further wisdom than to shelter and protect my ignorance. That seems backwards to me. So
yeah, it's wonderful. Well, Brendan, it's been great to talk with you, and best of success with the book. And I hope to see you again at another conference.
We have to see each other in person sometime. Take care, Steve.